In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how I drew this cockatoo using pastels and share my process of drawing feathers and how I build up the layers to create a realistic look. I'm Kirsty Rebecca and I make drawing and painting tutorials that are easy to follow even if you're just starting out. So I'll run through the supplies that I'm using because it's really important when you're working with pastels that you have the right supplies. With pastels specifically, it makes a huge difference which paper you choose, and I work on the Clairefontaine pastel mat, which comes in pads like this, or you can also buy it in large sheets that you can cut down to size. So I'm working on a mid-tone colour because it's much easier for me to judge how light or how dark I need to go with my pastels. And it's also much easier if you're working on a white subject like this to start with a mid-tone colour so that you can add those lighter colours as well as the darker colours on top. There isn't really another paper like pastel mat. It's really very unique. It's a bit more on the expensive side, but it's definitely worth the cost to get the results that you can achieve with this paper. There are other papers out there labelled as pastel paper, but they don't have the same sort of tooth that the pastel mat has and the same sort of texture. Some of them you just can't add many layers of pastel to, and if you can add a lot of layers of pastel, sometimes it tends to look quite grainy, and I just haven't found another paper that equals pastel mat. So I'm using pan pastels for the base layer of the bird and also for the background. You can apply the pan pastels using soft tools, that's SOFFT, and these are the most popular tools that people use with the pan pastels. They come in all sorts of shapes and sizes, but I'm using the smaller sponges which go onto these blue applicator sticks, as well as some larger sponges for larger areas like the background. Then I'm using a mixture of the Faber-Castell Pitt pastels and the Stabilo Carbothello pastel pencils for the details. I've also used one soft pastel stick, which is a white Rembrandt stick. I also have some cotton tips that I'm using to blend my pastel in between each layer. And I always keep a putty eraser with me as well, or a kneaded eraser, just to lift up any areas that have too much pastel or if I make any mistakes along the way. If you want to follow along with a real-time version of this tutorial, which is over 4 hours long, where I talk you through every step of the process, in the description there's a link to my Patreon channel so you can check it out. I've completed the background by layering in blues, greens, teals, and black until it's a nice soft out of focus look. And I'm making sure that I overlap the background onto the line drawing of the cockatoo slightly, so that when I draw the bird, I can overlap bits of that onto the background. That way there isn't a cut and paste effect where the background stops right where the bird starts, if that makes sense. So starting out with the base layer of the bird using pan pastels. This layer is just to block in the main colours, so you don't want to do any details in this layer because it will be blended out, which means that you'll have to go and do those details again. With my base layers, I usually start out with a slightly darker and more vibrant version of the colour in that section of the reference photo. That way I can add some lighter details on top, and also the vibrancy of the colours that are in this base layer will eventually be dulled down in the following layers, but some of that initial colour will still show through in the end, which helps create that depth and interest. When doing base layers, make sure that you don't add too much pan pastel because you want to be able to add the layers of pencil on top. So I use way less pastel than I do on the background for the base layer of the bird, and there's a lot of that paper colour still showing through in this layer. So that way you can make sure that you can still add those pastel pencil details on top. So a lot of people ask me about my process and how I know where to start, but I don't really have an order of which colours I choose. I kind of just look at my reference photo and pick a colour that stands out to me and then start with that. And then I move on to another colour that stands out to me and I just keep going with that process. Sometimes I do this with values as well. So I'll pick the darkest value that I see in my reference photo and start with that, and then I'll just move on to the mid-tone values or the highlights. So with this piece, for me, the yellow was the most obvious colour. So I started with that, and then I moved on to the darker shadows underneath some of the feathers. And in other pieces that I do, I might start with the eye because that's more interesting to me, or I might start with a completely different section because there's a really bright colour that I want to do there. It just depends on which subject I'm working on. When you're working on white subjects, or any colour animal actually, there will be colours from around the subject that are being reflected in the white feathers. This is even more prominent in the white or black animals than it is in coloured animals. So in this case, there are a lot of blues and also some yellows mixed into different parts of the feathers as well. Even in the darkest areas, I'm not just using grey or black, I'm mixing in blues, browns, reds and yellows depending on what's in the reference there. Even the lightest parts of the cockatoo aren't really white. You don't want to put pure white in your base layer because you won't be able to add more detail on top of that, which will make it look really flat. So I'm using a slightly darker color than white, so that way when I go on to my next layers, I can actually add lighter colors on top of that. I've kept the general shape of each feather by first blocking in the darkest shadows on each of the feathers over a large section, and then I went back in over the rest of the feathers with a mid-tone color. That way I don't lose my outline too quickly. Make sure you pay attention to how the feathers are laying and what kind of shadow they're creating, because if a feather is lying quite flat to the body, there won't be a dark shadow underneath it, whereas if the feather is lifting up a bit, there will most likely be a darker shadow underneath it. So pay attention to the reference photo to see how the feathers are laying. So don't just put the same type of shadow underneath every single feather, because it won't make it look very realistic. You have to pay attention to things like that. The base color is all about getting in the main colors and also getting the values there. So getting your shadows in the right place would definitely help you in the following layers. Here I'm blending out this base layer with a cotton tip, and there are a few reasons why I do this in between layers. One is that it pushes the pigment into the tooth of the paper, and the tooth is basically the little ridges of the paper which people refer to as tooth. So it's kind of like having hills and valleys. So when you run your pigment across the top, like your pencil or your pastel, it sort of catches on the top of the hills and then deposits into the valleys. So once you've filled up the valleys with your pigment, it creates a slick, even surface that's in line with the top of the hills, which means that you won't have any tooth of your paper left for your pigment to grab onto anymore. So you can't add any more layers on top when you get to that point. So by blending out the layers of pastel in between with the cotton tip, it really helps push that pigment into those little ridges, allowing more pastel to lay on top in your following layers. Blending it out also helps to create a smoother look in the end. It also blends the colors together a little bit more, and it also helps to stop a lot of that pastel dust falling off throughout the project as well. Before I show you the next part, if you want to follow along with my longer real-time tutorials where I talk you through every step of the process, then Patreon might be the solution for you. For a small amount per month, you'll have access to every tutorial that I've previously uploaded on your chosen tier level in a variety of mediums like pastel, coloured pencil, graphite, watercolour and more. You will also have access to the original reference photo, a traceable outline, and a list of supplies that I'm using, so you really can follow along every step of the way. My tutorials don't skip any stages or cut out any important parts of the process, and I will share all of my secrets to help you improve. Every month, I will upload brand new tutorials to the library so you can grow and develop your drawing and painting skills and take your art to the next level. You can also join in on our members chat group where you can ask questions or advice or share your artwork and talk to other members in the Patreon community. The link is in the description if you want to check it out. So now that I have my base layer, I'm coming in with my pastel pencils. I didn't add pan pastel to the eye area or the beak area because they're a bit more intricate, and it was a little bit easier just to come through with the pastel pencils for the base layer instead in those areas. And this layer is all about creating texture and then starting to define each feather a little bit better. So again, I'll be blending this layer out as well, so I don't want to add too many details in here. I'm just going to start to use the pastel pencils to better define the feathers and just start to create the right textures. I'm not too focused on the details at this point. The lightest parts of the bird are at the top of the head and the back of the neck, and also the side of the wing that's next to the background. So I've put my lightest colours there, which was more of an off-white that had a little bit of a creamy colour to it, whereas the white feathers on its face and the bottom left of the reference were a bit more in shadow. So I've added more blues and greys to those feathers in that area to create that shadow. So don't just go straight to grey in the shadow areas. Using colours like blues and purples will still create a shadow, but it will make it a lot more interesting that way. An easier way to see all of the colors that I'm talking about in your reference photo is by doing some color swatches. So I use an editing program like Photoshop, or you can use Microsoft Paint or online programs like GIMP, anything with an eyedropper tool. And I just choose an area with the eyedropper and then paint a swatch onto the side of the piece. And as you can see, there aren't many areas that are pure white in the reference photo, even though at first glance the entire bird just looks white. Another great tool is to hype up the saturation of the reference photo, because this really brings out any of those hidden colors. So I use this tool a lot for my underpaintings to really exaggerate those vibrant colors. So working with feathers is a little bit like working with fur, because you have to make sure that you're paying attention to which way your strokes are going. My strokes are quite messy in this layer, but I'm looking at each feather as a section, and I'm adding those pencil strokes in the same direction as what I'm seeing in that section on the reference photo. So I'm not worried too much about having the perfect color either at this point, because I'll be altering that in the following layers as well. I'm just using the white pencil at the moment to create the flow of the feathers. And again, make sure that you're checking to see which direction each feather is going in your reference photo as well, because in areas like the yellow part of the cheek, there's almost this like crisscross pattern rather than large individual feathers like on his neck. The feathers that are close to its beak are also really small, so make sure that you're using smaller pencil strokes in those areas as well. You don't want to do really long pencil strokes in areas that have short feathers, because it will make the feathers look long and vice versa. Once I've added the texture with the white pencil, I'm coming through with some blues, greys, and darker sort of orangey brown colors for the different shadow areas. So you really want to pay attention to your reference photo to see what color is in what shadow area, because it actually changes quite a lot on the reference photo. If you look at any reference photo closely, you'll notice that the shadows aren't all the same color over the entire piece. They vary quite a lot in color, which is why the color swatch sample is a great thing to have, because it really helps you see those different colors, especially in the shadow areas. I always recommend taping your work down before you start, and there's a few reasons for that. One is that there'll be a clean border around the edge of your piece to hold on to if you have to move it or frame it, rather than having to touch the actual pastel part. It also looks nicer when you sell your artwork and you ship it to the customer before it's framed. There's a nice border around the edge of it that just finishes the work nicely, even if it's going to get covered up when you frame it. The paper also doesn't curl up on the edges or move around too much while you work. And I also recommend taping it to a board rather than your desk, because you can actually rotate your board and get a more comfortable position for your hand to be in while you're creating different strokes or different angles. It also allows you to pick up the board and take it to a bin to tap off the excess pastel dust if you need to, rather than blowing the dust all over your desk. So I'm blending that layer out with a cotton tip again before starting on my next layer. In this layer, I'm paying more attention to the details and the values. So I'm really looking at each section of the feathers and seeing where the shadows and the highlights are in each section. For example, some of the feathers on his neck are lifting up a little bit, which is creating a darker and larger shadow underneath those feathers, whereas on the top of his head and sort of on the wing area, some of the feathers are laying quite flat, so there's only a very small light shadow area. If you do the same size shadow with the same dark value in each feather, it will look quite odd, so you really want to pay attention to which feathers are lying flat and which ones are sitting up and where those shadows are. So I'm trying to look at each feather as a shape rather than a feather, because some of the feathers don't actually make a lot of sense. Like the one that he's currently cleaning with his beak doesn't really look too much like a feather, so I have to just draw the shapes and colors that I see, and eventually it will come together to look like a feather. I'm also looking at things like the little splits in each feather, so not all feathers have an even shape. A lot of them look quite rough and sort of like it has strands, whereas there's other feathers that look nice and soft and even. So I'm making sure that I'm getting that variation in those different sections as well. So I'm coming in with some darker browns and blues and greys in the shadow areas, just to make sure that my values are right. So the two most important things to making something look realistic is getting your outline accurate and then making sure that your values are right. So making sure your shadows are dark enough and your highlights are light enough is really important to making something look realistic. People usually worry a lot about the colors, and they're not really that important when it comes to realism. I actually use color to make things look more interesting rather than more realistic. For example, I used a lot of blues and yellows that weren't really obvious in the reference photo in the shadow areas to make them look more interesting. So you don't have to have the perfect color blue that matches the reference photo, as long as it's the same value. So don't choose a blue that's too dark or too light. If it's the same sort of mid-tone blue as your reference photo, it doesn't have to be the exact same hue. And you can always just lay that color down on your artwork, and if it doesn't look right, and then you can just switch colors or add more colors on top to tint that color. So it's really not that important to get the exact same color as what's on your reference photo. It's more important to make sure that that value is right, so making sure that it's not too dark or too light in that area. If you aren't sure if your values are right, something that I do is take a photo of my artwork and then turn it into black and white, and then compare that to a black and white version of your reference photo. Having them side by side like that will really help you see if your darks are dark enough and your highlights are light enough, and then you can adjust your artwork from there. I'm also using a Rembrandt soft pastel stick to add some brighter white highlights on top. These soft pastel sticks are way more vibrant and opaque than the pastel pencils get, so I use them sometimes for areas that I need a bright pop of colour, but I try and save them for the last layer because they tend to fill up the tooth quite quickly, and it's really hard to lay more colours over the top of them, but they really do help get a bright, vibrant colour if you need it. When it comes to the amount of detail that you want to add, it's up to you, but I prefer my artwork to look realistic from a normal viewing distance, and then when you get closer, you can see the pencil or the pastel strokes. I really like looking at paintings in art galleries where they look realistic and detailed from a distance, and then when you get closer, all you can see is a mismatch of brush strokes and colours, and there really aren't many details at all. It's almost like an illusion where your brain automatically fills in those details from a normal viewing distance, and they're actually not really there. Anyway, I try and get my artwork to look a bit like that. I used to be meticulous about my details, making everything perfect so that when you have your nose pressed against the artwork, you can see all of those little details, and then I realised it's not really necessary to have that amount of detail for something to look realistic. I also get bored if I spend that long on a single piece of artwork. I'd rather create 4 paintings in the same time that it takes me to create one really detailed piece. So for me, if I can't see the detail that I'm adding from a normal viewing distance, then it probably doesn't really need to be there. If you want to follow along with the 4-hour real-time version of this tutorial where I talk you through every step of the process, then the link to my Patreon channel is in the description if you want to check it out. Otherwise, there's a playlist on the screen with some other pastel tutorials that I thought you might enjoy, so click on that and I'll see you over there.